Some good sneeze talk this morning.
Great sneeze talk. Yeah.
All right. NFL draft was nothing to sneeze at, especially if you're a Patriots fan. So we're gonna do something a little bit different today. Instead of just kind of walking through some talking points, each of us has prepared a take. It doesn't necessarily have to be a hot take, but it is a take that none of us have heard as of yet. So we'll go through, we'll each share it, and our lovely viewers will get to see the other two of us react in real time. So I'll get us kicked off with my take O, the 2025 Patriots draft. And, one thing that I like to do with this podcast is to be conscious of the fact that in sports, these things are covered, run, played, coached by human beings, by people. And sometimes you tend to forget that. You see them as numbers in a box score or names on a roster, that sort of thing. And I had thought about Eliot Wolf as a human, as a person, watching his media availabilities during and after this draft. Because one really big criticism that maybe I and other people had last year with him was that when he talked to the media, he seemed very uncomfortable, unprepared, unqualified was maybe the assumption that you got from that. And this draft, he sounded like a completely different human being. And it took me back to times where I think many of us have been in this position where you're an employee, a manager, whatever it might be, and you're put in the position of having to justify, explain decisions that you don't really agree with, that you don't understand the decision making process behind, and you end up sounding insincere, stupid, unprepared, all those sorts of things. And watching Elliot Wolf in this draft, I kind of had the feeling that that was the case for him last year. That a lot of the impressions that I personally got uh, might have been unfair or were unfair. Were unfair because he was dealing with so much stuff behind the scenes that many of us, some of which we were aware of, some of which we were not, that he was having to go out there and sound like an idiot. Um, and this time around, like he sounded like someone who understood the process. He understood the plan. That he had had conversations with intelligent people about why they were making these decisions. And when he was asked questions specifically about why this, why that, his answers were much more specific. Like he sounded smarter because he was a guy who understood what he was doing and he like believed in what he was doing. So that was kind of like my number one thing is like Elliot Wolf, the human being, sounded like a more comfortable, more prepared man, executive throughout this draft.
It's
Yeah.
nice that
So
the Patriots aren't. I'll just be quick, Dakota. It's nice the Patriots aren't needlessly being coy with his title this year. Like that didn't help last year's. No, it was like the draft was approaching, and they're like, "Is Elliot Wolf actually running this?" And they wouldn't say. So I do think having some clearly delineated things that they're not hiding from for whatever reason, like they were last year, is a sign of maturity from the organization.
yeah. So for me, it's a couple of things. I think there certainly was an element of not making it up as he was going along, but certainly not having like conviction or confidence uh, in whatever process the Patriots were doing last year. Like I remember, like one that stands out to me was during training camp. I think it was Greg Bedard asked Elliot Wolf at the. It was the only of time we got to speak to Elliot Wolf during training camp, like on the fields. Asked him about what was going on at tackle. The fact that at that point in the summer they had put so many different guys at both tackle spots. Caden Wallace was like running with the backups. Then he'd be like the top left tackle, and then Chuks Corf would be out there. It was all over the map. And I forget exactly what the question was, but Bedard asked Elliot Wolf, and he kind of had a really like snippy bullcrap response. Like he basically said like, "Oh, Caden Wallace has been running at left tackle," when the reality is he played like 2 snaps. It was a disingenuous answer, and so I think there were times like that where it seemed like he was he didn't really necessarily know what the coaches, what Mayo, what the offensive coaching staff, and what Scott Van Pelt, like what they were doing day in and day out. No one was on the same page. Maybe that was a byproduct of, the reporting that Jonathan Kraft was actually kind of pulling the strings as far as like the front office leadership. So I think, to Ben's point, there was definitely a lot of that going on. But the thing that always stood out to me about him last year was he just seemed nervous. Like, just that's it, to me. And I don't necessarily know if that has to mean anything beyond that. Like, I remember the first time I saw him speak, he was always really fidgety with his fingers, kind of like messing with them and looking out to the side, and he'd have to like pause himself and say stuff. And you could feel it in person that he was nervous. And I think that came across a lot during that press conference at the table at the combine. He seemed really nervous, and it might have been that that was a symptom of not many people being on the same page. But I came away from all of that thinking he just was nervous during media availabilities. And the Patriots PR team puts a lot on these guys' plates before they go to microphone. They sort of inundate them with, here's what you're probably going to get asked. Here's how you probably should answer it. Here's what everyone's talking about. And I think no matter who it is, whether it's a Eliot Wolf or a player, a lot of them get up there and you can see the gears turning and they're trying to think while they're talking if they're doing it right. And some of them get more nervous than others. And I always thought he came across as very nervous. And so I agree with you, Ben, that this time around, he seemed to be much more comfortable, both with what the Patriots are doing and just in his own skin.
Because that's like that nervousness is a byproduct of the not believing or not having faith in what you're saying, sort of thing. I mean, you guys can, we've been in meetings before, and you guys have asked me questions about a certain thing, and I, you see me pause and kind of like, okay, wait, what was said in the managers meeting that I'm supposed to respond to this? So like he's probably going back in his head and saying, okay, what did Stacey James, like when he was preparing me, because I don't want to answer this comfortably and say
right,
our coaching staff doesn't know what it's doing. Like, I have to talk about, we're administering a process to capitalize on the, blah, 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 blah.
And I also don't want to be Bill about it, because I've just done all offseason saying we're no longer the hard-ass Patriots. We're going to be less like Bill, this and that. And so I think they were all uncomfortable. And remember, that was Eliot Wolf's first time in that kind of role. He'd always been sort of an assistant style GM or a lead scout where you're not required to do media availabilities. So he looked and sounded like a rookie a lot last year when he was doing it.
I don't want to harp on the point that he didn't really have a role for a good chunk of last offseason, but I think that is part of an overarching thing that there was no structure last year. Like, for a team that had written into someone's contract that he was going to replace the head coach, it's like they had no plan for once that actually happened. It was like, all right, Mayo will take this title and then we'll go from there. And it literally feels like every decision was made in a vacuum almost. Like, think about last year's draft. It's like he knew he needed to pick Drake May. And then after that, I was like, well, let's see who we can get. And that's why you ended up with Jalen Polk in the second round. And what was it? Javon Baker was a fourth rounder. So this year, it seemed like maybe this is the Vrabel effect beginning in earnest that we always hear about, where it's like it seems like things are a little bit more organized, and at least like there's like, this is going to sound like corporate jargon, but it almost sounds like this change we're seeing in Eliot Wolf is because he's being empowered to actually do his job. Like, I can almost visualize last year him and Gerard Mayo sitting in a room together after they start being like, who's going to speak first? Like, no one knew who was in charge. Mayo didn't know what direction he wanted to take the team in. So at least with Vrabel, whether it works out or not, it's a guy who has someone used the word conviction earlier, someone who actually has a vision, a plan, and it feels like they set out to do that. Like, we sat here last week and talked about, we want them to just have a normal draft. Don't go off the board, fill your needs, all these things. I think that's the top line point of the draft, which they addressed a ton of needs and they made true decisions. So I think there's a lot less of the flying by the seat of your pants, which is, there's just structure that has clearly been lacking, and that seems to be returning now.
Yeah, and the last point I'll make on it is, I think then this isn't like inside knowledge or anything. I'm just sort of speculating that, last year he had, like, Eliot Wolf's, his forte is player evaluation, whether that's on the college level scouting or whether that's going out and poring over film at the NFL level. and evaluating players and then their potential fits with whatever team he's working for. Like that's his thing. Um, working out all the contracts and being a GM and everything that entails, which is about a lot more than just scouting. I mean, he's obviously held some of those responsibilities, but not quite to that level. Like again, he is first and foremost like a really strong player evaluator. And I think it was clear last year, a lot of this other stuff was put on his plate, and he probably would have been more able to handle it if he also wasn't babysitting Gerard Mayo as much as he was. So it just seemed like his head was spinning a lot. Whereas this year, it seems like, he does. It's not in title, but Vrabel clearly is the GM head coach to some degree, and Ryan Cowden probably is above Eliot Wolf. Maybe not in title. It's probably more clear to them behind the scenes. And it seems like, just from me looking outside in, it seems like Eliot Wolf has just been able to focus on what he's really good at this offseason, which is just player evaluation across the board. And so, maybe he's just more comfortable with that, and that's why he seems more comfortable in the interviews.
Perfect. All right, let's roll right into Dakota's take. Dakota, what was your first reaction looking at this draft?
My take is I officially hate the Joe Milton trade. I
Explain.
hate, I was reserving judgment. I didn't like it at the time either, just because I was like, I, I wasn't necessarily taking the bait that they could have gotten a third round pick, though I think maybe that was possible. But in the fifth round pick from the Cowboys just didn't feel like enough. But I thought, if nothing else, wait until the summer when QB needs emerge, and then you have more leverage and you can get more out of teams. We saw it last year with Matthew Judon, right? If they traded Matthew Judon at the start of the offseason, they weren't getting a third round pick. They waited until late in the summer. The Falcons had a big injury on their pass rush and other needs in the pass rush, and the Patriots had him over a barrel, and they were able to get a huge return. And so for Joe Milton, like, I would have just waited until that. Again, I know there was this whole talking point about they didn't want to have him in the room with Drake May because Joe Milton fancies himself the starter. But it's not like Joe Milton has the Patriots over barrel. I don't think they are in control of what they want to do with the asset. But with all that said, I was waiting to see what the Patriots would do with that in the draft. What would that fifth pick become? Do they use it to trade up into the fourth or something? Like, let's see. And ultimately, it turned into them getting, part of it trading down, and they got kicker Andreas, I can't pronounce his name, Borregales, long snapper Julian Ashby, and cornerback Kobe Minor, who was the final pick in the draft, the Mr. Irrelevant. Meanwhile, the Cowboys obviously got Milton and turned the pick the Patriots gave them in that trade, number 217, into a defensive lineman, Jay Toya. So essentially, the Patriots traded Joe Milton, who, say what you want about him, he was awesome in that season finale and clearly has starter upside. That doesn't mean he'll be a starter, but he has starter upside. Like, to me, it at least is as promising as Jacoby Brissett was back in 2017 or whatever when they traded him for a serviceable receiver. And then so to take that asset and have it become just a kicker, a long snapper, and the last pick in the draft, a cornerback, even in a best case scenario for those players, if you get a franchise kicker, a franchise long snapper, and let's say Minor is like a decent special teamer, to me, that's still not enough for, what the potential value of Milton could have been. Again, I know that they were worried about his personality going into the summer with him in the locker room and the whole thing with Drake May, but I just would have waited it out and seen if a team like the Steelers or someone else got desperate during training camp or going into training camp and pulled the trigger then. Because like as it stands now that we see the return is, I hate the Joe Milton trade. I don't like it at all.
I'm glad you brought up the Jacoby Brissett thing, because that was directly where my head went. Was they waited until cut down day and they got the Colts, and that was Philip Dorsett, right? It was Brissett for Philip Dorsett straight up.
Yeah, and a solid player. Like, I don't even know
But
who
Dorsett was a
be
great
right now. Like, let's say you traded Joe Milton for, I'm just throwing out like a Michael Gallup. I don't even know. Like, that's a bad play. That's a bad example. But I'm just thinking someone, a serviceable like third-ish, fourth-ish wideout. I'd rather have that than dart throws at kicker, long snapper, and the last pick in the draft, which essentially is an undrafted free agent.
So, we hear all this stuff about how Vrabel runs a pretty tight ship in all this, and we're worried about Joe Milton having an attitude that he's the starter when he was a late pick and they took Drake May number 3 overall, and he was obviously like, if you are trading a second year backup quarterback because you're worried that he's gonna like wreak havoc, it's like, first of all, how did you not know this was going to be an issue when you drafted him? That doesn't just come out of nowhere.
Right.
um
Yeah.
and two, it's like that's kind of a commentary on your organization if you can't reel that guy in. If someone in that position is going to have that, and I mean, speaks to the issue they had last year. They had a different receiver running their mouth every week, and it was a different person who had no NFL track record. So I agree that it was bizarre use of the asset because the upside, I mean, this was a quarterback heavy draft, and the class still altogether was very uninspiring. Like Joe Milton's upside greatly outweighs a large swath of the quarterbacks who got taken this past weekend. So I do,
100%. 100%.
yeah, and I agree with you, Dakota. Like they would have been better off waiting until the summer. I don't get what the issue is. I mean, it was poor use of that. The timing was just odd.
Yeah.
I don't disagree about the return for Milton. Um, this is retroactive because I don't know that they knew they were going to come out with the specific players that they ended up with in this draft. But I don't think Borak, whatever. I don't think he's a flyer. I think he's going to be their kicker. And I
No, I
also
know, but
think that
Chad Ryland was too.
and I think that Ashby is going to be their long snapper. Um, so I don't think that those are necessarily just like, well, late round throwaway, like we'll take a flyer on these guys. I think those guys are literally going to be the starters.
Yeah,
Come
but
next
so was
season.
Chad Ryland, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, so
no,
like, my son.
but with what I'm connecting this to though is you're going to have a rookie, essentially an undrafted long snapper. You know, like seventh round is like that's deep. You're going to have a rookie kicker, and what's something that hurt them in the special teams game last year is holding and long snapping. I mean, the kicking was not great, but there were some situations where the hold was not down on time sometimes, and like it. I know it's stupid to say we're making a decision based on who's going to be the holder, but I do think there is something of having, okay, we're going to have Josh Dobbs, a veteran who's going to be in there. I don't know whether he'll be, consistently on the special teams unit, but I think that is something that could bring some stability, maturity to that special teams preparation from the get go, rather than those two young guys having to prepare with maybe a part half the time with a Joe Milton who fancies himself as too good for this. So there's that. Going back to the Milton thing though, like the real thing with Milton, the Milton trade that made me go from being like okay to being like what is going on here is when they also had to give up that 7th round pick to get the 5th, because at that point I was like, well, now we're not even trading him for his value. Now the Patriots have essentially given up the bulk of this. Like they're
Dumped
not.
him.
Yeah. From that it went like this is not even a trade. This is like a love you, see you later, sort of kick you out the door.
Yeah, and if
Yeah,
you consider that, you go, Logan. You go.
when that trade went down, Odyssey, my full-time employer, we have the Cowboys flagship as one of our stations. So I popped that on. They were falling all over themselves about the value that they got. Like they couldn't believe that they also got a 7th. They were like, they stole this guy from the Patriots. Like that was the reaction in Dallas in real time. Um, yeah, I mean, it I I think you make a good point, Ben, that it's like they took someone who entered last year as their number 3 quarterback and turned him into 2 guys who are probably going to start right away this year. Like even if they are special teams players, like even if they are guys whose snap counts are going to be markedly lower than someone who's, an offensive or defensive player, they still address needs. So I do think that kind of offsets the sting a little bit. I think that is one way to put the Patriots spin on it. So good work there. But yeah, I guess that's one way you can kind of make your peace with it.
Yeah, and this is probably reductive. And this is a reductive way of looking at it, but like, if you just essentially, because the seventh round pick for the Cowboys wound up being a defensive lineman, and the Patriots took a corner with a seventh round pick. So if you just take those as a wash, it's essentially Joe Milton for a kicker and a long snapper. And like, if you're a Patriots fan that watched that game, that season finale, and then you immediately went into a coma, and then you woke up this week and you said, "What happened to Joe Milton this offseason?" And someone said they traded him for two special teamers. You'd go, "What? That's it?" Like, even if they're good special teamers, it's just like, that asset turned into three special teams players probably, and one of which might it probably won't even make the team. And Kobe
But
Minor.
we're also talking about a guy who we're looking at a 1 game sample size here.
Yeah, but I'm
So
sorry, like,
it's just as likely that he's waived by the end of the season.
right. No,
Um,
I agree, but you don't. I do. It was a 1 game sample, but a 1 game sample from a quarterback is different than like a 1 game sample of like a kicker who went out there and made like 6 field goals and a couple from 50 yards. Like,
but
he went out there and basically in a start against a good team, granted backups, but a good team, and was awesome. So I'm just saying, like, you don't do that just kind of by accident for a full game. Like, it's hard to do that. Does that mean he can repeat it as a full-time starter? No, but it definitely means something. Again, it doesn't mean he's great. Matt Flynn, right? Like, Matt Flynn had good starts too, but I don't know.
I mean, Bailey Zappi, like if you can kind of take it there if you want, like I was never a Zappi guy, but people talked themselves into him after small sample sizes because he was a reprieve for Mac Jones.
Right, but Joe Milton certainly has more projection in him than
Yes,
Bailey
right,
Zappi.
right.
Like, you looked at Bailey Zappi in those games and you're like, this probably is the max of Bailey Zappi. Whereas you looked at Joe Milton in that game and you're like, wow, what if he gets even better? You know? So I'm probably talking too much about Joe Milton and not enough about how the Patriots had to delete a tweet about Kobe Minor.
Oh my
after
God,
drafting
I know.
picking up. I don't know if you saw that, Ben.
I did.
Yeah, yeah. Tough day for a social media intern, probably.
I don't think it was an intern. I think it was
You're
probably
right.
someone who.
That's not an intern.
Yeah,
You're right.
I think the problem was it was not an intern. I think it was probably someone who was like closer to your guys' age, or God forbid, even closer to my age, that like didn't understand like the connotation of the reference and thought this is just like a silly thing to share. Yeah,
That people say. People are just saying A minor
Right.
for fun.
yeah, right, precisely. All right, Logan, you're up. Give us your take on the Patriots 2025 NFL draft.
This might end up being, and again, human beings, the caveat you gave, this is as excited as I've been about a Patriots draft class in a very long time. Like, I think this has the potential to be one of their best draft classes in many years. And I think that is partially because that is not at all a high bar to clear, especially with the way they've drafted over the last decade, probably. Like, you really, to find draft classes that it's like, all right, they got more than one or two useful players. You got to really start going back. So I think that there is, I was harping all last week about like they need to build the team around Drake May. And I think that, that's why I was a proponent of Will Campbell. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink the arm length. Just draft the guy. I was surprised by the Henderson pick. I was surprised they went with a running back in the second round, but he's explosive and he can catch passes. Like, that was one of the things we talked about is with a running back, they need someone who can kind of complement the power game that Stevenson brings. So I thought that the decisions they made a lot of sense. I like the idea of just draft a kicker in the late round. Don't overdraft him like Justin Rohrwasser or Chad Ryland or whatever. And another thing, and they started to do this last year, and I'm not overly thrilled with last year's draft class yet, but they mostly just took guys from Power Five schools, which like I am fine with finding guys in Division II, finding guys on the margins, but it's like you don't need to be drafting somebody from Chattanooga in the first round. It's like you look at like let's go back to 2003. After you get past Oregon and Georgia Tech, it's Sacramento State, Troy, Eastern Michigan, Liberty, Jackson State, like schools that aren't known for pumping out NFL talent. I'm not necessarily saying, all right, well, they loaded up with guys from SEC schools, like they're off and running, but the galaxy braining that they have a tendency to do sometimes, I feel like they diverted from that. So, you know, it's a low bar to clear to have one of the better draft classes of recent memory, the Patriots. And I think that they actually drafted like high floor guys who will fulfill some needs. So go ahead, Dakota. I see that smirk on your face.
No, I just the galaxy braining made me laugh. No,
Is that not what they do? I
no,
mean, I like
100%.
Kyle
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Duggar, but you took a guy from Lenore Ryan with your first pick. Like,
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. You know, whether Bill Belichick's galaxy brain drafting can be justified. But um, I would just say generally, like many people, I like what they did in this draft. And again, none of us know anything about any of this, so we're all just sort of guessing. But it sure seems like they went in there with a more coherent plan and really got good value with a lot of their picks. I mean, when it's so unanimous from like the real experts who like I trust, like Brugler and Daniel Jeremiah, like I put a little bit more weight into it. But what I will push back on, and I'm not trying to do the Felger Mass thing where it's just like let's just shit on the draft because everyone else is liking it. I've heard a lot of people say that they deserve credit for prioritizing offense, especially on the first 2 days and going into this and saying Drake May's the asset. We need to surround Drake May. That doesn't necessarily mean that they did a good job. I think people are forgetting that last year they only drafted one defensive player. They went into that draft, they drafted Drake May, and then the next 5 picks were offensive players: Polk, Caden Wallace, Layden Robinson, Javon Baker. 2 receivers in there, and then they took Dial and then Joe Milton and Jaheim Bell. So they very much prioritized offense last year too, and clearly, made surrounding Drake May a priority after drafting him. And TBD on most of that class, and the early returns aren't good on most of them. So I just think, a lot of people giving them credit for prioritizing offense and supporting May. I don't think that really is an argument for anything because that doesn't mean anything if the players aren't good. I think what they do deserve credit for is, going in with a more coherent plan, like you said, not galaxy braining, and it's seemingly finding good value with a lot of their picks.
I do think it kind of underscores the point that they just wasted last year. Because it's like
No, you don't know that yet. I mean, you can't judge a draft class until after year 3. We don't know if it's a waste, but I'm just saying.
yeah, I mean the early returns are not encouraging. Um, and so my point is basically like, and I'll add to another thought that I have was it doesn't surprise me as much that they didn't focus on defense because we're not that far removed from that unit being really good. And you could make the case that Covington ran it into the ground and the fact that the offense couldn't get off the field or stay on the field rather. Put that defense in a very difficult spot. So maybe you could make the argument that like this was a pretty strong unit for a while prior to 2 years ago. Like maybe let's see what we have there. Maybe there isn't as much of a need because if Mike Vrabel's as good as getting more out of guys as he said to be, they also focus a lot on defense and free agency. So I think that you can justify, focusing more on offense, but it's kind of like, yeah, that's because you probably blew it last year. It seems like you might have blown it last year. So you have to go do it again and protect yourself.
Yeah, they drafted fewer offensive players this year than they did last year, even if you remove Joe Milton.